Hi, I'm Bailey. I'm reporting from Group 1, where we were discussing annotating annotating audio and annotating video, and also tangentially annotating with video and audio, which was a clarification we needed to make early on. I think a distinction of annotating audio and video that we've come to here is that it's different in general than annotating a piece that is not a text, but composed of text. And so there's sort of three different layers that we need to think of, at least if we're talking about video. There's a visual layer that can be annotated. There's often a textual layer that can be annotated. And a third layer, which was?
The timeline of the scrubber.
The timeline. So, think of the waveform or the scrubber, okay? And so for us, it's like all about finding what is interesting to you, what vector that you want to follow while you're annotating, because I think we can maybe come to a consensus that having all of that happen in like one easy to reference sort of like visual representation is very difficult. We have like so much more data there than your regular data set that tweaking those out is an important problem for audio and video in particular. We, of course, discussed metadata, extracting automatically what we can from the audio and the video, whether that be speech to text or crowdsourcing of metadata, and how we can best do that, given that people are particularly poor at paying attention to long pieces of audio or video, and in generating when they don't have the option to cut out at a certain point. So we discussed that shorter files and shorter bursts of contribution are probably the best way to delve into that and to get feedback from people that is meaningful and useful. And finally, we discussed ontologies for search, and it seems you can generate your own. That is one option. Also, just using them in general in order to get greater semantic meaning and find greater relationships between data is really important, particularly for audio and video. And I think that is all.
We covered a lot, so I'm going to have to read my notes. I'm digesting it. This was about annotating the visual and visual annotations, as well as kind of annotating experience, which is very visual. Specifically, the experience in a museum or the experience of visual works. So we quickly covered some of the things that might be obvious to anyone thinking about it, such as virtual reality, geocaching, which was brought up as a way of annotating, was rather interesting. Cartography, and the obvious that wall labels and audio tours in a museum are in fact a readily acceptable way of annotating things. What quickly became clear was that somehow annotating things that are considered precious in a way, or that always seem to have authority behind them, is a very contentious, perhaps polarizing idea. And that may be because things that we consider precious, singular objects, stand alone, and so to annotate something visually, we usually think, well, that visual annotation also is something that can stand alone. And so the signification between two images creates some friction, or at least has made it difficult for the technology of visual annotation to progress, though there are a lot of good ideas. So let me see here. The other contentious part was authority of annotations, and that being more important perhaps in a museum context or the context of a work that's visual, because people are used to writing about writing, but the dialogue of annotating about paintings or photos or videos seems to be quite different, maybe thanks to YouTube. And that gamification was perhaps a way to get the public involved, but it again becomes an issue of authority where curatorial annotation is more accepted. The same way research annotation is more accepted because people commenting on scientific papers, if they're not a scientist, it's difficult to weed all that out. There was a lot there.
I read earlier this week that you're the smartest person in the room. You're in the wrong room. I'm definitely in the right room. A lot of smart people here. So a little bit of the agitator topic. What does successful annotation look like, or what are the intended impacts of it? Kind of frame the conversation with this notion of if you left annotation out and recorded a lot of what was presented in the conversation of content linking to other content and being able to, one document to another and video and text and what have you, and you played that back to somebody and asked them what was that conversation about, the answer would probably be something like the web, the internet. And so where does the line between the web and annotation, where is that line if you keep bringing in all these functions and features? And so we kind of went around the table and we said, what does annotation look like? And it was clearly obvious to us that it was a very personal, and there were a lot of different sort of contexts for what successful annotation looked like. And they varied from measuring and validation for like the research scientists, connections, engagement, context, community, especially very temporal communities. And then finally we arrived at what I think is the summarization of what we think answers the question. And it's that annotation should be a new means of discovery. It should be a new way to discover content that isn't possible without it. And one of the things that we kind of all sort of light bulb came on and almost became really excited about was the notion of doing annotation where you could do it in a sort of a Q&A structure. So you could basically mark a request for annotation, as opposed to just necessarily being a person who highlights and then annotates, but that you could say, I would really love to know more about this, and then other people would arrive and answer and bring that sort of extra content that you're looking for to you, and that would be a way of engaging it.
So we had a session on annotation for the scholarly domain and how that's different. And one of the first things we started talking about initially was the reputation of scholarly annotators, and spent a little time discussing how scientists are judged. Currently, a lot of your career, your grant funding, your positions and that sort of stuff is based on your scholarly output, the papers you write, how well cited those papers are. So there's this annotation culture within the scholarly community already, and it's hard to shift to doing new kinds of activities until those get kind of rolled into the fold of the existing, how you're judged. Maybe the best way of describing this would be to say that people who produce kind of thought work, their stuff is different from people who produce physical, tangible things where it's something other than their thoughts that are judged. We came up with one major relevant difference in the scholarly domain relative to other domains. Annotations must absolutely have URIs because citation is really important in this domain, and thus you must be able to refer to the annotation somehow in another annotation, which could be an original scientific contribution in its own right. So that's one big difference. Another difference is that there's a different audience and there's a different community. There are some thoughts that annotations could help raise the exposure of scholarly works, make it more accessible to a broader public. But then we got into a discussion about the benefits and disadvantages of having broader public exposure and annotation on your work. It could be a distraction for researchers feeling like they have to spend time arguing with lay people about, points of the work that the lay people don't really understand. But at the same time, it's also viewed as doing public outreach is viewed as a good in and of itself. So there's definitely within our group a tension between those two things about how annotation could help or how it could hinder overall. But more of the people who fund research, more of the funding agencies are requiring data and code in papers to be open and thus available for annotation, whether we like it or not. And so that really puts the responsibility on us to have good tools. There's also this notion that annotation of scholarly content has a higher level of criticality. You could be changing, things that go into, mission-critical systems. You could be changing patient care based on, an annotation of a work, and so there's this extra level of criticality about getting it right. But at the same time, if we take too long trying to get it right, somebody else might come along with something that's crappier but more focused on user growth and become the de facto system, whether we like it or not. We did spend a lot of time talking about noise after that. So do you want to capture all the input, or do you want to keep the noise down? We think it's important to get the community part solved first, getting the user engagement solved, but then, because then they could help moderate, kind of like Slashdot or Stack Overflow, that kind of thing. But there's some other domains, such as mathematics, where there's a right or a wrong answer to every question, and it's not really as accepting of just, general random commentary. And so you don't want to have too many barriers to the community and reduce engagement since you're starting with a smaller group to begin with.
First, I'd like to thank all of the people that sat at table 5 and participated. We had what I thought was a really lively and great conversation. Some of the top topics that we covered, I'll just list them first, was intentionality, topic maps, subject identity, trust, filter bubbles, BitTorrent for knowledge, and free radicals. And the free radicals came from the fact that I showed a couple of slides from one of my online presentations where we used annotations to federate conversations that were held by individuals for themselves, for their own purposes, at different places in the world for different reasons. Free radicals turned out to be the subject in both cases. In one case, a medical student has discovered that free radicals are part of the immune system's response to bacterial infection. So you could say that free radicals are used for saving lives. The other person found that free radicals can cause cancer. So here the same term free radicals means death in one side and life in another. And it turns out that the two didn't know each other, but along comes a cancer patient who goes into the Federation platform where those two have made their annotations and discovered the little wormhole between the two universes of discourse and realized that his taking antioxidants was counterproductive because he had cancer and he was having recurrent bacterial infections. So his life was saved. He stopped taking his antioxidants and he goes ahead and annotates those two annotations to point out that they create a situation which is dangerous. From there, a medical doctor comes in and sees his annotation and decides to build on it and create an entirely new structure that points out that bacterial infections indicate antioxidants, and later, through other conversations and annotations, a new concept called compromised host is added as a constraint on her claim. So this is how annotations have created a whole section in a knowledge federation. That was the basis on which we ended up talking about topic maps and intentionality. Intentionality because if you are doing annotations with a specific intention, you're liable to be doing something that is more useful to people other than yourself. I mentioned the idea that if somebody annotates an image of a cat with the word fluffy, it's probably quite useful to that person and far less useful to the rest of us. Trust is required. Trust networks are required. Filter bubbles come because search engines today spend their time trying to model you as a user, trying to figure out how to give you better answers. And it turns out, at least in my experience with Google, the only way to use Google in reality is to log into a browser that doesn't have my Gmail account on it, and they don't know who I am, and I now start getting novel results. If I go into Google on the browser which has my Gmail account, I keep getting the same answers. Those aren't helpful. That's it?
Yeah.
So that's it. We believe that federating, the opportunity exists today to create a platform within the entire I Annotate effort to begin the process of federating annotations along with federating the knowledge resources that are being annotated. That's it.
Some discussion. The first takeaway is that the law is really complicated, and annotating the law is also pretty complicated. But beyond that, there were some pretty interesting takeaways. The first is that annotations offer an opportunity to provide for explications of the law that's accessible to the public and to legislators. So not only will you have the law as, the corpus of law, but you might also be able to see what the law means alongside the law itself, and that's an opportunity that exists for annotations. The other thing that we discussed at length is the idea of a semantic overlay on laws and the use of ontologies to essentially help understand the law at a deeper level. We also, I'm trying to read my notes. Right. So this is really an interesting sort of aside, but annotations could theoretically transform the culture of lawmaking and the expectations of what lawmaking actually would entail in a pretty profound way, both at the legislative process, so that annotations would essentially be opportunities for debate amongst legislators at the point of text versus at the floor of the House, and that creates an opportunity for judges to better infer what legislatures meant when they passed laws, and the public could better understand what the laws mean as it applies to them. And this creates an opportunity, and annotations create an opportunity to completely democratize what the law means. So that's the talk, or just what we talked about, I suppose. Thanks.
About common extension for browsers for our projects, and we, after a very short time, decided to move this to the weekend hackathon. It's better there, and we went then to others.